Ready?
Sure, I'm ready. Hey,
How do we
Deborah.
start this? How do you want to start talking about this?
I don't know. Actually, I got an idea.
Okay.
So, did learn a new skill today,
All right.
or not today, but recently. I think I told you about it via text, but I think I told you this. But learned a new skill.
Okay.
I was working on some of the little projects that I have around the house. One of them happens to be a planter on the side of the house, which is made out of brick, but the first few courses of brick have kind of like come off. And so it just looked like a jumble mess. And when we got it, it was what it was. It was just like we took it as face value and stuff. But we just were trying to clean it up. It's ours now. So now it's my jumble mess. And so I'm trying to unjumble that mess. And I
Look respectable, would you? Jeez.
yeah, exactly. And so Rochelle and I went to Home Depot. We're walking around. Happened to just walk every single solitary aisle, of course, because that's sort of what you do. And try to do I really need this? I don't know if I do
It's
or
like
not.
IKEA, except you don't have to hit every aisle at Home
Exactly.
Depot.
Exactly. Well, I don't know. We were walking through like the lumber.
I'm
And,
looking
oh,
for
what do we need?
improvement ideas.
Exactly. So, at the very end of, so we start off at one end, which is the outdoors stuff.
Yeah.
And then you go all the way to the other end and it ends in masonry.
Okay.
And
Yes,
so,
outdoor garden to masonry. Yes, that is the order.
so then I was just like, oh, you know what? I saw this, box of mortar. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to fix that planter. And so I basically drew upon all of my memory from back in school when we actually did have a bricklaying class where we just did a little. And of course, that was probably the last time I actually physically laid brick, to watching this constant episodes of This Old House and just watching the Masons go to work and how you do it, all this other stuff. And I got the went ahead and purchased everything, and it sat around for a while, and I'm like, all right. And my wife's like, hey, you better do it before it starts getting colder. You're not going to be able to do it at all. I'm like, good point. Winter is coming.
Winter's coming.
And so I went outside and the other day and just started going to town. Now I realized that all of the bricks that I had, they were either like mixed matched or broken or whatever, and so I was like gluing them together with the mortar.
Because you can't find new bricks that look like the old bricks, right?
No, not at all. I mean, and so I just kind of like, but I was surprised at how well I did for somebody who doesn't normally do this
You
all the
got
time.
Louis Kahn on your house there.
And that and it was just like, and sure enough, if I wasn't like standing there holding a brick, and it's just like, what do you want to be? Do you want to be this planter?
You had to do it.
Like, I don't think you want to be this planter. I think you want to be a nice little paved area where we can have a fire pit.
Well, that just calls for a sledgehammer then.
Yeah. I fixed it for now just so it doesn't look, like, granted it's in the backyard. No one's ever going to see it.
Yeah.
But, I fixed it for now because I see it.
Right. Yeah.
And so, of course, it's fixed. And now I want the planter gone.
Yeah. You can spend money twice.
Exactly.
Why fix it once when I can spend money twice? That is the basic homeownership rules right there.
Exactly. The basic rules. It's like, well, I'm going to get this. And, so.
And not only that, but you bought the tools to fix it that you probably will never use again.
Well, thankfully, I only bought a $9 trowel with 10% off and a box of mortar, which, I think total for that repair job, plus the moisture that was sucked out of my hands and fingers. I guess fingers are part of hands, right?
They are. Yeah, last I checked.
But I got to a point where the trowel was just like not going fast enough I'm like, reached down in there, got a big old glop of it, slapped it down, set the block, and then used the trowel just to point, just to point. And I was actually surprised at how well my pointing job turned out.
Say that again. The trowel wasn't fast enough. You
The
couldn't buy a
trowel-
faster trowel?
I couldn't buy a faster trowel. The trowel was not applying the mortar as
man.
fast. I bought a pointing trowel, and should have bought a bigger trowel.
Have you seen those?
An appropriately sized trowel for laying brick, which I did not.
Have you seen those videos where there's like multiple masons working on a wall, and there's the guy who's laying them down, and like so he's like throwing the mortar, and then he lays the brick down, and then he turns to like grab more mortar, and the other person pulls the brick, steals it.
Oh yeah,
and it just keeps going and going, and the guy never catches on after like 5 or 6 or 7 bricks. How does that happen? Those are. I could watch those all day.
Yeah, or just watch that one over and over and over again. Yeah.
So, right, you want to get to the real topic here?
So the reason why I say that is because one of the topic that we're going to talk about, one of those people was telling a story, and that story happened to be about Louis Kahn, and when he was talking about his buildings, he referenced Louis Kahn and the whole brick story.
Right. Well, let's save that so we can come back to it later. I think it makes sense for us to start with, we want to talk about 2 different lectures that happened at MDC, Monterey Design Conference, which I was lucky to attend earlier in the month. I guess it was last month now. But the couple of talks really stood out to me. Of course, they're all amazing and inspiring for different reasons, but there was 2 that I thought it would be great. And so they also were available to people via streaming. And so you didn't have to go there in person. But I do have to say, like watching the videos afterward, it wasn't as good as being there. Just so you know, I just really want to rub it in right now.
I was going to say, I feel you're rubbing it in because, I wasn't there and I watched it on your streaming login.
You just outed me.
Oops. Did I say that out loud for somebody who was being a jerk about me not being there?
That'll never make it into the episode, right?
But yeah, no. The one thing that I really love about MDC really is just this feeling of, it's just this Rocky movie feeling, right? Because everybody is so inspiring. Everybody just like, you almost feel like, I want to go punch a building now. It's just like, because it's just.
Why can't you love a building? Why you got to punch it?
I don't mean punch it as in like, club it in the face or anything. I'm just thinking that, it's just like,
you're getting fired up.
Rocky movie, you're like, right. That kind of thing. It's really, honestly, every time I went there, and it just isn't this the first one in person?
Yeah, in 3 years.
In 3 years, yeah. So that's wow.
Yeah, and, it was a big deal for sure. I mean, I think it was similar to AIA conference, right? It was just like, oh, finally, geez, this has been we've been missing this.
Did you walk away with a disease? I mean, gift?
Not in that way. No, I did not.
Thanks, AIA.
Yeah.
That AIA was a lovely parting gift for us.
Super spreader event.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that didn't happen here.
Well, that's good.
I mean, and a lot of it is the setting itself, right? Being in Monterey,
true.
Being in Asilomar, and seeing the people. It's all about the people, for sure. It's about being there with your people, our people, for sure.
And just the setting, the buildings, just the mood, just being there with like-minded people. I mean, because everybody's we've been to conferences, architectural conferences.
Are you using air quotes right now?
Yeah, I am.
I could hear the air quotes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And none of them feel the way MDC feels. None of
It's kind
them
of a
really.
homecoming, right? Like it really does feel like this. You feel a warmth that you don't get at other conferences from it.
It
And
it feels like you're returning to the they this almost like doe-eyed kind of like the reason that you got into architecture, before you kind of got a little jaded, with the with just like the way the profession really is
right, right.
and everything else. And I don't mean whatever. Um, whatever.
Yeah.
But
Stop right there.
exactly. But it's just like it's so encouraging. I mean, I remember when I was standing next to, and of course, I'm blanking on Steve Ehrlich. I was in my first MDC. Now, I've got a bunch of Steve Ehrlich books, and I'm sitting there and I'm just talking to the
Yeah. You can do that there.
no pretense. There
Right.
was no pretension to him. He was just a down to earth guy, and we're just sitting there chatting. And to be quite honest with you, before I realized who it was just fun to like have that conversation. And then then he talked about a specific project, and I knew that project. And I was just like, holy moly. You're Steve Ehrlich. I've got 3 of your books at home. I'm an admirer of your work. But it was just like, I didn't need to. I didn't need to like feel all, like, I mean, I did feel a little giddy because I'm like, hey, cool. It's like you're meeting somebody that you like admire their work and stuff. And that's cool. And I didn't even like, flinch and say, oh my gosh, it's just, I totally was just like, cool. This is a great conversation and I'm going to be in the moment. But that's the thing about it is like, you can have like
That's what it is.
the
Right.
Deborah Berks, which, kind of leading into where we're going.
Yeah.
and just have I mean, she was like, kind of like, this is great, when she was talking about like, kind of like the intro into her talk.
Yeah, a lot of the speakers who are invited have never been before, right? So it is a new experience for many of especially if they're not in California or international or
Right.
et cetera. But yeah, I think that you can definitely kind of feel it when the newness of it to them, and also kind of the, let's just continue the conversation over wine at dinner aspects of it as well, right? It's like, I don't have time to get into it right now, but I'm happy to later. Let's just keep the conversation going then.
So as part of that foreshadowing, I guess you can lead the intro into our first subject.
Yeah. So the first day, the Monterey Design Conference goes from Friday kind of afternoon to Sunday lunchtime, and so you get a couple of nights at Asilomar Conference Grounds in Monterey, which it's actually south of Monterey a little bit, and it's right on the beach, right on the water. The Julia Morgan designed conference center, and you have meals together there. And, there's a cafe, and the talks kind of go throughout the days. And there are mixed groups of invited speakers from what they call headliners to emerging professionals. They've got people who come internationally from international locations to speak at this. Mm-hmm. People stay on the conference grounds in the, there's various types of housing on the conference grounds. All the buildings are spread out. You get these beautiful views. You get the beautiful ocean air. It's kind of the perfect time of year to be in Monterey. And so the first speaker that was headlining was Deborah Berke. And Deborah has a practice in New York, and she's also the dean at the Yale School of Architecture. And I don't know where she finds the time to do all of this, but she figures it out somehow. And she came to speak about her work and kind of kick off the conference from a keynote almost, but not really. Like she's not really setting the tone for the conference, but she did kind of set the tone for the conference in that her main themes, which I don't want to give away her main themes yet, because I'm interested to hear kind of what your takeaways were hearing it too, and not being there in the room, but just like not seeing the whole context of MDC. Her talk probably hits you a little bit differently than it hit me, because I'm kind of constantly renegotiating what MDC means as I hear every additional speaker. So I'm interested to kind of dig into her talk, because looking back at all of MDC, I felt like it really did set a tone, even, and I'm sure that was kind of a goal of hers, was to kind of hit hard and not just make it this frilly, let's make this about me kind of. It wasn't about her really at all. There was a much larger theme to it. But I mean, overall, just impressions from her talk for you, hearing it for the first time fresh.
Well, so as much as I'm familiar with her work, I've never actually saw her speak. And one of the things that I appreciated about it is even though she knew she was in a room with a bunch of architects, and you could easily like inundate somebody with just Archispeak and bore the living crap out of them.
Mm-hmm.
Not to say that Archispeak bores anybody, because that's what we're trademark. But the thing that I appreciated was just that she just felt, it was like made the room feel comfortable about a lot of information that she was giving. So I could see where like the overarching idea that she was presenting was the pivotal role that architects play in, carbon emissions, in the role of designing responsibly and sustainably. But she did it in a way where she presented her work and and how she was achieving kind of these goals. And she had said that during COVID, when work was slowing down, that she kind of paired up with an engineering firm to basically write a white paper about sustain. Basically, what was it? Why am I blanking? Help me out here.
No, this is way more fun.
Just sit. The term that she hates, adaptive reuse.
Adaptive reuse. She said she loathes that. But she doesn't have a better replacement.
She was like, she loathes the term, but loves the practice of what she does, and loves the notion of adaptive reuse supporting this notion of sustainability and carbon reduction. And as somebody who has spent, God, it feels like the past 20 years of my career, honestly, since I would say the last 15 years of my career has been adaptive reuse projects.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm very conscious of what what kind of contribution I'm making to carbon reduction when I go into these projects. And to see it from her perspective was really something that was both eye-opening because of just the amazing way that she's able to do some of these projects, and very creative. And in some of mine, I will definitely say are not as creative. Although in my mind, I would think, oh, this would be, like I would have loved to have done this project similar to this one or that one. It's just the nature of a lot of the projects that I worked on were, public works projects that were like, you got to stay, you got to adhere to a budget. We're going to basically ask you to do more program than our budget allows.
Mm-hmm.
So, the drill. You've done it. You know where you get to pick and choose your design options. But also the way that she had, talked about her projects as they approach the sustainability, the, carbon reduction, the, just this, like kind of like zeroing in on the responsibility of the architect, was almost validating, because, a lot of times, people would, talk about these projects that, I was working at, isn't it just easier just to demo it? And sure, there's sometimes when you think in your mind, God, it would just be so much easier. But then when you really sit down and you look at the, let's just call it the sustainable proform of the nature of that particular style of work, you're really like, you're saving on construction costs. You're doing selective demolition. You're getting more bang for your buck in reusing these buildings. Plus, in a lot of ways, you're holding on to, and she didn't really talk about this well, I guess she did in a way, but no, she did actually in a lot of ways. Now that I'm actually thinking about because now like the talk is come flooding back in.
Mm-hmm.
But in a lot of ways, she did talk about, and like I talk about, saving these architectural heritage pieces, or it's just saving a bit of history while also reinvigorating it for new history.
Yeah, there was a lot in there, I think, because she actually talked about an article that she wrote. And I guess one of the things about, kind of underlying the whole theme of adaptive reuse is that the embodied carbon's already been spent, basically, right? Like it already
Mostly,
exists.
yes. Yeah.
And not only that, but the demolition and the waste created through new construction and demolition, yeah, that's all part of the carbon story as well.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
and so while there is reuse that usually includes reconfiguration and things, it's a lot less than
Sure.
what would happen under new construction. But one of the things that she talked about that I thought was really interesting is that she wrote an article called "Against Preservation,"
Hmm. Hmm.
and I'm sure that offended many architects in the audience who are
Probably.
historic preservationists, right?
Yeah.
But she does make the case, and I've never been a preservationist myself, and I've never worked on a project that. Actually, that's not true. I have worked on a project where that was talked about a lot and attempted in different ways, but it wasn't like I'm on the West Coast, right? It's just not as big of a thing as it is on the East Coast. So it didn't offend me. I could just kind of feel the room, especially as you sit in kind of a historical building as you're here consuming this talk, in the Julia Morgan Design Merrill Hall at Asilomar Conference Grounds. So. Not that it needs to be redone at all, but it is historic in several different probably ways of thinking about that beyond just the age of it. So there's like the iconic part of it. So there's a lot of interesting things about this idea about being against preservation, and she kind of backed that up by talking about how preservation fortifies and memorializes the past, and adaptive reuse is more flexible and sincere, authentic and genuine of this time, right? It takes what's been done in the past and it stretches and adapts it beyond because times do change, right? And I think that's the thing, that if architecture is going to make a dent in the carbon problem of emissions, right, through embodied, through operational, through construction, through demolition, all of these transportation of getting the things to the site, like all of that, we have to reuse old buildings, but that doesn't mean you just lock them into time as they always have been, which there are so many people out there interested in doing, right? It's very much like, it's not just a modernization, it's like preserving the good parts, right? It's like telling stories. It's about being able to show off the history of a place, good or bad, right? To tell the stories of what makes that thing interesting, special, something that we should know about, right? It's kind of she did have those kinds of provocations in her talk.
Yeah, and see, and I totally agree with her, but I also disagree in a way, because I actually do appreciate preservation. But almost all of my experience in preservation comes from more adaptive reuse. So in cases where, like, working in downtown Annapolis, even though the buildings that I was working on was not on the historic register, they were actually they were contributing to the historic fabric.
Right.
And so
those are very specific words.
Yeah, I was making sure that I got it exactly correct.
Right.
And so even though there was an opportunity for me to do certain things to the building, and there were certain things that I had to stay true to. And so the Preservation Society was very much looking at like the two existing buildings that were on the site, and me being very faithful to the preservation of their exterior. Now, the interior, and the connection between the two buildings.
Do whatever the hell you want.
They very much were a proponent. In fact, actually, we had a proposal that was more in keeping with the style of the existing buildings, and they were like, no, 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 you guys aren't getting it. You can do this of your time, of the time,
Yeah.
you know, and which was great because then we could actually do a more adaptive reuse.
Yeah, she actually defined adaptive reuse. I don't know if she tried to do this specifically, but it came out during the talk and talking about it as being neither pure acts of establishing something new nor the safeguarding of something old.
Right, exactly. And I love the interweaving of the stories. You know, when you do adaptive reuse right, it's not a preservation project. It's not a full modern project. It is the interweaving of the two.
Yeah.
And those are the things that I feel like make those, you know, those types of projects far more successful. I mean, because if you look at like, you know, a lot of her projects, now yes, most of like the like big impact in some of the earlier stuff was, you know, more of an interior intervention. And so, you know, you really didn't know. But then as she started to do more and more of those projects and she started showing them, then, you know, you start to see the more adventurous kind of like, you know, additions of the time. And then, you know, just, and it was just like, they were so elegantly done. I mean, and that was the thing that I took away from it. It was just like, it was almost like, man, I wish I could go back and do, you know, these
Yeah, I
projects that
think these are my favorite kinds of projects too. And I guess I never really thought of it until this talk and actually thinking about it afterward, like being kind of poked to think about it this way.
yeah.
These are my favorite kinds of buildings to visit
Mhm.
because, and she talked about it during the talk, that I guess this just kind of is a great way to say it, right? She talked about unlocking the potential of an old building
Yeah, yeah,
in a modern time.
yeah.
And to me, that is something that like we can walk into a building as architects and see potential. I'm trying to find a house to buy. Like every picture that I look at on the
You're looking
internet,
for,
you're looking for potential.
yeah,
Like
exactly.
you
It's like,
can't look at just what's there. You have to look at the potential when it comes to that kind of thing because
absolutely.
you're obviously looking for some kind of an investment, but also just like how do you fit into that thing that's already there? And you don't make yourself fit it. You hopefully I want to make it fit me, right? I want to make it
Right,
fit my
right.
family. So that idea of unlocking the potential is super interesting because there are really creative ways to do that. She talked about the sole purpose of her practice is to cut holes through old buildings.
Yeah,
And that was
yeah,
a funny quote, right? Because it's like that's what a lot of times that is the answer because they were so rigorous in their, you know,
right.
these are old factory buildings and they're old, you know, they're just very, you know, low floor to floor and really rigid in their structural layout and there's no sectional quality to these buildings. And by bringing those new qualities to old buildings and by kind of, you know, scraping away the paint, right? And peeling away the layers of the onion that have built up over the decades, it brings new interest. It makes
Yeah,
them more accessible to people in interesting ways about like how buildings are made and what kind of stories they have locked into them. It's really interesting. I think it ties into it, this. I want to put a bookmark in this part because I think this ties into something that we're going to talk about in the second half of the episode with the other talk that we're going to talk about.
mhm.
So I'm going to try really hard to remember this thing, but you know, just this idea of buildings. There's this struggle with buildings and how precious they are for architects, but people don't necessarily think of buildings as precious unless it's a historic building, right?
Right,
And then it's like, no, I'm going to lay down in front of that freight train that's coming because you can't, right? Because it's got to be perfect and it has to be preserved exactly how it was of that time and knob and tube and everything, right? Like it's just got to be exactly how it used to be, or it's not perfect anymore. But I think that this whole idea of them not being precious and peeling away those layers and leaving them exposed is such an interesting, cool thing about the mix of old and new in when an adaptive reuse project is done, at least the kind that I like to visit. you see that intervention and it is still raw. It's like they tore off the band-aids of because that building was so unmaintained and was
Mhm.
unrepaired, and then they kind of leave some of those areas open, wounded, and you can see the layers that were there. And it's cool because it like takes you back. It's like, what has this thing been through? What has this building seen over the decades? And does anybody know these stories? And then can now we can point at that thing and say, here's the story of what happened with that. I think that's pretty cool to kind of expose that stuff. It doesn't really happen with new buildings.
One of the things that I thought was a success of one of the adaptive reuse projects that I worked on was that I was connecting two buildings, and to traverse back and forth between the two buildings, essentially the new addition, the new corridors, had to basically, leave one building and, you know, go across the way to the next building.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that I kind of, well, one, it was almost by nature, by the requirement of the elevation change between the floor to floor heights between the two buildings. There was they were 7 foot and some odd inches different in height from, like, say, the third floor here was 7 feet higher than the third floor here.
Yeah, yeah.
And so to
These
traverse
buildings were
those,
never meant to be connected physically,
right? And because they were so close, that corridor had to be ramping into, because the footprint was so small, I had to basically do these kind of like S-shaped, like
This sounds like that test on the ARE where you had to like design the stair and the ramp to go between these two spaces, and they just never fit in the space provided.
Yeah.
You had to be really creative.
and so exactly. But one of the things that we did is rather than gyp the walls and hide the exterior of the buildings, we left the exterior exposed, and so you're passing through and you're seeing, like, if we had to infill a window, we would recess it back so that you could see there was a window here. Or we would like leave the window open and filled with like restored window, but it was looking into some, like, the library spaces, this particular one, or the art room. But it was just it kind of, so you were traversing through one building, traversing through the modern building, the modern part of and just trying to like celebrate that procession, and celebrate the existing buildings, celebrate the new buildings, celebrate the new program of the buildings, and then go back to celebrating the next old building, but with like its new program spaces and all of that other stuff. And it was telling the story of all of the three buildings,
Mm-hmm.
in a manner that I just you don't get that from a new building unless it's a contrived attempt at creating something old, or to make it feel old, to just set a mood.
Right.
But this was like, kids get to rub their hands across, like this 100-year-old brick or 150-year-old brick, or and it's just it's a textural change, it's a mood change, it's a playing with the light, playing with the transparencies, just things that we just don't normally get on a new building. I mean, yeah, we can do fun, exciting things with new buildings, but there's just this nature of things. And we even, like, we would expose the structure, and I don't know what it is, but the way a steel truss was done in the early 1900s versus the way the way we do some of the steel trusses now, it just looks so different. And
Mm-hmm.
and there's such an exciting kind of like dynamic feeling to this heavy riveted steel truss. And
Just
we
feels
just
authentic and like handmade, right? Like
exactly
it feels like people were a part of
because
that.
it was.
It was, yeah.
And we don't do things like that anymore.
Yeah.
It's all of it. You can see the transformation of, because then I kind of exposed my structure, the new structure, but you saw the difference between the two. You saw that, one was machine made, these fine fillet welds and all of this other stuff, versus like this heavy riveted, kind of like truss that was just, it felt artistic.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's cool, man. I
It,
think that like there's so many neat ways to then like have conversations about those things because there's something to talk about. Like the building doesn't just fade into the background. There's interesting things happening there that you've chosen to bring to the surface so that people can talk about them.
and that was the thing that I liked about what she did, was because she was very deliberate in, um, kind of exposing, like talking about the new language, the new use, and everything else, celebrating the old, maintaining some of the old, in just in a very beautiful way,
Yeah.
which was,
And
loved it.
for the purpose of, right, which getting back to the saving millions of tons of carbon emissions, right?
Exactly.
So it's
Yes.
and
Exactly.
very clear to say like not all old buildings should be saved because there's many old toxic buildings, there's many old unsafe buildings, but for the ones that can be, that can with this kind of problem solving attitude applied can become something that's useful today
Right.
and inspiring even right today for whatever purpose people can come up with. I think that's huge. And like, I think that we've talked about this before on the podcast, but like the answer cannot always be a new building. Architects
Right.
cannot continue to just accept new commissions for projects. I mean, I don't know how you actually convince architects not to do this, right?
Well, yeah.
but the answer cannot always be a new building. It has to be to reuse this. I mean, do you want to be a part of those conversations or not? I guess there's probably a lot of architects who do not want to be a part of those conversations, but for the ones who see what architects' value can bring to those projects, that I think there's a huge opportunity there. I mean, she even talked about it as like revitalizing, right? Like kind of the kindling project for revitalizing different areas and how
Right.
many new projects, new and adaptive reuse projects happened after they did the first one. I mean, that's a huge success story, right? Because it does begin to bring new life, new energy to a place that could have probably was dying, you know. Yeah, so
Eh,
she ended with architects and designers are the primary contributing authors of the built environment, and we have to do this. What we owe
Yeah.
the planet. And I think that I mean it's a great call to action. And so kind of, setting the tone. It's interesting, right? Because I've been to talks at MDC in the past where every project is a shiny new thing. And she she even had like a picture of the skyline and she talked about it being
Oh yeah.
a charm
Yeah.
bracelet,
Uh,
right?
yeah. I wrote that down. I was just like, chart breaks. That's funny.
Yeah, and the idea of just showing current work, meaning new work, and how that's no longer acceptable for architects, and really owning this issue, and owning that we can help affect change in the biggest ways possible, as the authors that contribute to the built environment. I think that is a huge call to action, and I thought it was a fantastic way to kick off MDC, and it was a recurring theme that came up many, many times. And I don't know if I was an architect with new projects that I would want to come after her after that.
Right.
Obviously, the show must go on, um, but it was kind of interesting in the way that it set the tone, and it does make you think after that when people are showing just new work or you know, heavily carbon embodied and operational carbon like type projects. You're just like, huh, right?
So, so let me ask you this. So, obviously not being there, and I only watched two of the talks. How was, because I feel like the next one that we talk about, it was more on the tail end, um, or at least a day
It was
after,
at least a day later. Yeah.
at least a day later. So there was a lot of talks in between the next one and Deborah Burke's. What was the tone that was, so like, out of the box, you've got this, to me that was, even though I was watching it, streaming it on my phone, and it didn't have like the energy of the room, and just the
Mm-hmm.
spirit of the place and everything else. I still felt pretty good about it. I was like excited to hear it, and I actually had it. I watched it twice,
Yeah.
because what she does kind of spoke to like what I've done in my career, and
Mm-hmm.
and it was just like again it felt very Rocky movie-esque. It's just like that feeling that you get after a Rocky movie where you're just like, yeah,
I don't
kind of
know,
thing.
man. It's hard.
Like,
It's
how
hard to
is
read the room because it's such a big room. There was like 800 people there. So there was like a social thing after, and this is one thing I like about MDC is like they'll line up a series of talks, and then they'll send you out to like just a breather, and they have like social hour, and maybe they'll have a book signing, and you can go visit
Mhm.
some vendors, but really like you can just talk to people about the things you just experienced. And I felt like after that one, there were the most kind of deep considering conversations, at least in my experience. I cannot speak for anybody else, but I felt like those were the kinds of conversations, like we were talking about the architectural education process. Like, what is pedagogy teaching people? Like, is it just about creating new forms? Is it just about new buildings? Is it always, or is it, I mean, I actually remembered talking with somebody about old infill projects that we were doing when we were in school. And I thought, um, is that enough of the conversation today in architectural education? And I have a feeling that some of it is because there is so much emphasis on carbon and sustainability and those things in school today that were not as much so when I was in school.
Mhm.
Um, so I have hope, but I felt like there were some really deep kind of conversations happening that were really questioning our role in solving this problem. So I have to say, like, I thought that was, I think, something that reinforced that it was probably the most impactful talk that I experienced at MDC this year.
Okay.
Yeah, it was cool.
So one of the things that I liked about it, in talking, going back to the whole brick notion, is some of the use of her brick, because
I can't
she's
hear you
working.
again, just so you know. You must be leaning back.
I did.
Yeah,
Oh, leaning back and relaxing. Anyway,
that's not allowed.
um, one of the things that I did, thinking about, like me talking about my brick adventure into masonry, um, and we were talking about and again, foreshadowing to the next talk.
Hmm.
This, what does a brick want to be? Because she does so much of her, or a lot of her work is in the city, and a lot of that adaptive reuse work is in the city.
Hmm.
The way that she approaches, both the kind of like reuse of existing brick and then kind of like new brick, it's just some of the tapestries that she created by use of brick was just amazing. I
Mm,
mean,
oh yeah, yeah. Yep.
um, a couple of the different
That
projects that I
Next
was
Haven
thinking.
project.
Yes,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
I was just like, I see, this when people, and I know that you don't, you probably haven't done a lot of like brick projects. I've done a lot of brick projects, and
No.
I'm always trying to find, a slightly, you know, different take on the conventionality of like how you use brick.
Hmm.
And it's just like, okay, what can I do a little bit differently? Is it through colors? Is it through recesses? Is it through just this shift of planes where I can get a little bit of like shadow play on it and all that other
Hmm.
stuff? And these are the things that kind of make some of those projects fun, especially when you're using a more conventional building material. And to see some of the ways that she had approached some of the use of brick is just, I mean, it was mastery. Just absolutely loved it.
It is it because there's like this visual interest through shadow, most
Yeah,
almost
yeah.
texture and shadow, and really though, the building, she was even saying, I believe it was that project, like the building's job is to fade in the background, and the art is the thing that should be on display.
Right.
And that's what Next Haven was. It's a gallery, right? So
Right.
among other things, school and things like that,
Yeah.
art school. But I just think that is so interesting because it's like there's something for everybody, right? For the people
Exactly.
who want the art to be forefront, there it is. For those who want to look at the architecture, it's still there. Like it has the substance. It's not flash, and I appreciated that about it.
Well, because what's interesting is the way. So I say that because the way that sh- you know she may not have necessarily. I guess she sort of did, but I mean, she didn't necessarily talk about like. I mean, she talked about the use of brick and things like that, and as part of a sustainable approach. But a little bit of foreshadowing to the next talk when he was specifically talking about like the ways you can use a conventional building material to be far more expressive. um, and though she didn't necessarily focus in on all of the different moves and stuff, just when you look at the approach that she took with that conventional building material, she's definitely like got it. Like it was what our next talk is going to be about, or the next speaker that you had gotten a chance to see that we're going to talk about. He started talking about this use of brick and
Mm-hmm.
shadow
Mm-hmm.
and light and just like the responsiveness of the material. And it's just like you looking at those, I just keep thinking about like the way that she just used all of this materials. Just it's just like, oh, it's just a simple brick building. No, it wasn't. It was just
I'm getting more here.
these just beautiful moves that just made the use of that conventional material so much grander.
Yeah. Well, let's introduce the second talk that we're going to be focusing on, and that was with James Wines, who is an environmental artist, but he dabbled in architecture. I don't know if that's the right word. I mean,
I mean, he's
how would you
I
how would you
I think
portray him?
he sort of said it that way, that um I mean, yeah, I guess it's dabbled, but I mean, I think that he even said that it kind of like dabbled, but then that his environmental art, you know, the next logical step for what he was doing was architecture. You
Yeah,
know,
like getting out of this, creating abstract art in for these installations, like what's next? And somebody like
right?
just basically being provoked by somebody else to say, like, are you going to just do abstract art forever? Or are you like, what's next?
Yeah,
And yeah, that was interesting. So James Wines is in his 90s, and they started off this conversation, which was done remotely. So he came in via Zoom because he is disabled, I guess, at this point. And
yeah.
but man, super sharp
Oh my
and
gosh, yeah,
witty and funny. And so I'll put a link to that YouTube video because it's kind of a mini short. It's a short documentary on
yeah.
Site, which was his architecture and environmental art studio that is, I would say, pretty internationally known for their work on the best company big box stores. I guess those were
Yeah.
probably in the 70s,
Best
80s.
products showroom.
Yeah, best products showrooms. And do you do you remember the first time you ever saw those projects? I'm trying to. I know I've seen them a lot, and I remember
So
them being impactful on me, but I can't really place when I first saw those.
I remember them in school.
Yeah, yeah. I think it was
Um,
before architecture school for me when I first saw them.
and and obviously either they didn't exist or didn't exist anywhere near I was.
Right.
And so I'd
Yeah.
never seen one. And
Right.
so the introduction of it was when we were talking about, we never went to such of a deep dive. And it wasn't even a deep dive in the conversation that was being had at MDC. It was more revealing to both the motives and where those motives kind of grew out of. Because again, this was he was an environmental artist, kind of bringing awareness to, you know, like kind of like these social ideas, but they weren't, as he was challenged. I mean, they weren't something that everybody was thinking about.
Right.
It was just like, and then and really honestly, to be impactful, I truly felt like listening to the conversation that was going on between him and Reed, that it was very, it was just it was this unveiling of what seemed like the natural progression of his work.
Mm-hmm.
It was just like, where,
Bigger
the obvious,
scale.
yeah, exactly. It's like the obvious next choice is, let's reach a grander audience, and that
Right.
grander audience will be, through a building.
Yeah.
You know,
And to find somebody willing to do that, right?
Oh my
Like
gosh.
to find a client that is willing to put this on display, and like this was risky, right? Like he
Oh
talked
yeah.
about a meeting, like a user group meeting, and I'm sure that
Oh
the
my
user,
gosh, that was great.
it was like there was this user group meeting and talking about how this
Yeah.
this architecture was going to ruin people's, they were going to be scared to go in, and
Yeah.
they were going to question the quality of the junk they were selling inside. and it, after the meeting, the owner, he's like, "Hey, just hang back, I want to talk to you." And he tore up the notes and threw them in the trash. He's like, "We're doing it anyway," right?
He's like, when can you start?
Right.
And I was just like, that's like, that's a client who has got absolute faith in the vision that these two shared, because it wasn't necessarily just James's vision. It was,
No.
the
client had the
CEO.
appreciation for sure.
Yeah. Because I mean, as James was kind of explaining, he was an art connoisseur, and he was like, into like the avant-garde kind of like pop art and all that other stuff. And so, just to him, it was just a natural, in his own mind, it was just a natural progression of, his love of art to, his form of commerce. Right.
And I loved the social commentary aspect of it, because they were doing something that the buildings, it made people question, it made people interested, it inspired people to, like, made the curiosity level had to be like off the charts, right? Like you see the corner of the building peeling off the building, right?
Right.
People are genuinely scared that the wall is going to fall on them, or the part where the corner of the building pulls out and the bricks, are articulated in a way that looks like the building is broken.
Right.
It's things like that it was interesting to hear the story behind it, because he was talking about how it was a junk culture, and it was like the building was about the junk culture, and how they had a sense of humor about it, and how there was humor in their projects. And like, as architecture goes, I think we all could agree that architecture is mostly humorless, right?
Right.
And so for him to do this, like these follies, basically, and have a client willing to actually pay for these things to happen, which sadly don't, I think he said that maybe one still exists, but it's so badly, it's like turned into a church, and it's just not even anywhere close to its original form anymore, that it doesn't even count. But for these to be gone, I think is also speaks to that junk culture, right?
Right.
That is the natural timeline of when something no longer serves its purpose. What do you do with it? You throw it in the trash, and that's what's happened to these buildings. I think that's super interesting. Additional commentary on the timelines of these kinds of projects. But I'll put a link to his website in the show notes so that everybody can see what we're talking about, because if you haven't seen the talk, it's really hard to envision. And once you see these, if you've seen them before, you'll instantly recognize them. And if not, it's definitely worth looking at these projects. There's a little gallery on their website that you can kind of scroll through some of the examples.
One of my favorite ones was, I think it was the one where the corner was like just peeling off, and it looked like the brick facade was like peeling away.
Yes. Yeah.
That,
like paper, like a giant sheet of paper.
Exactly. And apparently some concerned citizen, was like rapping on the door, just like, I need to like let you guys know that, your building is falling apart. And They're like, no, that's the way it was.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
and and he
Genuine
was,
concern. He's like, this is amazing.
and I guess there was the story of the little old lady who came up and just said, hey, um, I've never thought about architecture. I've never thought about buildings before. You
Mm,
have made me think about buildings.
yeah,
And that was sort of the thing, is because, especially with like big box stores, and the commentary of the big box stores, like nobody thinks of them. They were so just random, and nobody really like gave two hoots about what was
right.
actually, and so to to be able to, like, just kind of like almost raise awareness of, hey, there's a building here, kind of thing. I mean, if you think about it, you think about like the um what most buildings are, is especially big box stores, is like you park as close as you can to the front door, you run into the to the building, you do your shopping, and you kind of like run out, and you never really, like, you're engaging the building, but you're only engaging it at a product level. You're
Hmm.
never engaging it as at an architectural level.
Hmm.
And so you never pay attention to what the hell's going on. Now we do, because we just look at everything. We look at all of the different buildings, and whether they're good, bad, or indifferent. But most people don't ever really pay attention to that. And so, you know, here was an opportunity to almost, offer up, the social commentary. It's just like, this building could be falling apart and you guys wouldn't pay attention to it. It's just like, oh wait, yeah, it's like the God, that the one building where like the crumbling bricks,
Hmm.
it's just people were like, oh, it's the first time they probably ever thought of a building, or it was just like it. I mean, I
It
don't know.
it was something that provoked thought and
Exactly.
curiosity about
Yeah.
buildings. Yeah, to your point. I mean I love that, and it happens from the parking lot level. Like reading
Yeah.
like this is the first time anybody ever tried to read architecture for a lot of people, right? They see it from afar. They see it from a distance. What is going on over there? And it just begs you to get closer and closer and closer and inspect what's going on. And in many cases, there's additional things going on the closer you get, right?
Right.
Which makes it
Right.
even more interesting, right? Until you get inside. and then it's just like a normal shopping experience, I'm sure. It was interesting for him to talk about how some of his projects have been kind of bastardized over time, right? And he talked, like, as an artist, it's just, he just kind of presented it as data. It was very interesting because he talked about how some clients had basically asked permission to like expand a project, and it was the original Shake Shack that was
Oh yeah.
in the park. Is that in Central
Um,
Park?
I
I can't remember.
think he said it was Madison Square Garden.
Madison Square Garden. So this idea of, he's like, well, yeah, and the client was like, don't worry, we have in-house architects who are gonna take this, and he said
Yeah.
I'm sure that the audience at MDC can, you hear the words in-house architects are taking over your project, is a
Kiss of
kiss of
death.
death. I totally related to that. That was hilarious. But this idea that art is precious, but buildings are not, is something that came up in his talk, right? And he was talking about how we build these galleries, and if there's one little scratch on a piece of art, everybody freaks out, right? Like
Oh yeah.
this is the kind of thing that it just cannot be messed with. But architecture, right,
Okay.
is there's something about, he says, there's something about architecture that invites invasion and destruction.
Well,
And
so
he's just thought that was an interesting thing, because he's like, there's not enough art in architecture.
so when he said that, then I immediately thought back to Deborah Berke's speech, because here's somebody who was talking about that we shouldn't, like, in regards to historic preservation, we shouldn't be putting these buildings on a pedestal and putting them under glass, and this is it, that these interventions, through the adaptive reuse, are saying that they're not necessarily precious per se, but they still have value in the story that they told and that they'll continue to tell. And so I was thinking about when he said that and kind of like how she approached, the, let's just call it the preciousness of buildings,
Hmm.
where they're they don't need to be, in a way.
Right. Yeah.
But
I mean, it's where work happens. Like a lot of
right,
times when she's talking about it from that context, like these aren't precious spaces. Like this is where the real work happens. Like the it needs to function. It needs to serve the
right.
function of the space. And so, yeah,
But
it was interesting because I thought the same thing, right? Because he's talking about it kind of from this precious nature of art, and then she's
right.
saying, not these
So
spaces aren't precious.
so so when he was approaching it, yeah, so that was exactly it. Is he was approaching it as art, as buildings are, as could be as precious as art. Though what's interesting about it is that just by the very nature of the design of these, best showrooms, they kind of showed that the lack of preciousness, right?
Hmm.
That, you know, by it crumbling apart
Hmm.
is when it becomes, more, almost more interesting, um, in a way. I know that I'm drawing something that probably wasn't really there. Um, but it was just, the nature of, but so let's take a turn real quick. And so, we're talking specifically about kind of like this almost like social commentary
Hmm.
of the best, product showrooms, and, kind of like his approach to kind of almost like bring awareness to buildings and things like that. But, he was also the approach that he took in the construction of a lot of his buildings, especially like the one that was in Richmond that was kind of like built around a bunch of trees and stuff.
Yeah,
Like,
I think
he
that's called
really,
is that called a rainforest building? Something like that.
yeah, something like that. And I think that's the one that might still be the only one that is somewhat still existing
Oh, it's
in.
not the rainforest building. That was just called the forest building. Yeah. That's the one that's been turned into a church. And he said
Right.
they chopped down all the trees. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. But I mean, but the whole point of those is like it was environmentalism before there was environmentalism,
Yeah.
when it
Right.
came to our thought on building in the built environment, because there was a consciousness to it, and in a way it was even a consciousness to like how it was built, what it was built out of, and things like that was kind of interesting about like what he was doing. And he was as avant-garde on the design aspect as he was on the environmental aspect of things. Because
I was just reading a little bit about that on an article that I found on Arc Daily, and it said that only later did he realize that adding shading from the preserved trees significantly reduced the building's need for air conditioning in the summer months. So I don't know that he intentionally did that,
okay, okay.
but
Well,
but
I think
happy accident, right?
it was interesting, is because I think the moderator did kind of lead in that, and maybe it
Yeah.
was a little intentional. I don't know, but
Well, there was
okay,
also they talked about the ghost parking lot project, right? Which
yeah,
was where they paved over these vehicles in this parking lot, and it kind of made it into a playground for anybody to do whatever they wanted on, right? The whole idea was that it was an interactive place for kids are playing and they're rolling over the with their bikes over the cars and stuff, and and
right,
and like that was a total statement, right, towards
right.
environmentalism. I mean, you're building these big ass parking lots in front of your big box building to sell junk, right? I mean, there was a lot going on there, even though the execution of it looked very simple. It just people, I don't know that people connected the dots. I'm sure many people did, and it was just like, this is really good stuff. And then other people are probably just like, what the hell is going on here? Right? It just went right over their head, like a lot of art does, right?
Yeah,
Very interesting though, in the way that it kind of provokes and pushes and prods on people, and how so much architecture doesn't. Because kind of as we're thinking about this best products buildings, I think about big box stores today, and I'm sure that all of these large corporations have their in-house architect team. And what do they do to when they design these big boxes? Like they design them as much the same as possible, right? There's no, like, they have to fit into the community. There's no statement being made other than this is our brand, right? And it just has to do with the signage and the stucco, right? It's just kind of interesting to see the lack of creativity, curiosity, art in buildings today. I mean,
Yeah.
this is goes back to the when we talked about Heatherwick's article on Design in the, when we were talking about
Right.
buildings, and it's just like they're so freaking boring, right? And you
Right.
look at these
Right.
buildings that were done in the 70s, and like it's a big box store, and they were not boring. And I
No.
think that's what's so interesting about, and just seeing the kind of the character behind that whole thing is pretty cool.
I wonder if like the way that he approached these in a very playful, artistic manner, you know, did it lead to these, and maybe it was, just before or kind of during, but like the, deconstructivist period or the postmodernist periods where, they were, say what you want about like Pomo or, Decon, they were very playful buildings. They weren't boring. There was nothing about them that, I mean, they brought awareness to, the place that they were
The
creating,
built
right? I
environment.
mean,
Yeah.
it wasn't like, it's like, like so many times you can just like drive through a city and let's just like not pay attention, because it is what it is, right? It becomes
Oh,
like
it's total background. Yeah.
it's background. It's just more of the same kind of thing. And then you see like these buildings that just like stand out because they're just unique and playful and just, like these, they're, it's, oh my God, this building's falling apart, but it's not really, it's just like, it's because it's trying to draw attention to itself. It's trying to be, less serious about it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And, and so you just like, wonder if like, I don't know if he was like the kind of like gave birth to some of those movements or not. It was kind of funny as I'm, looking at another Arc Daily thing where they were basically talking about how, like it was almost like his buildings were kind of like in a slap in the face of like, some of the other movements like Venturi Scott Brown and things like that. And I'm just like, in a way, they actually are very much, like they're hand in hand with each other, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like they, what was the historians, I'm not going to say their names, describe the Tilt building as exemplifying and subverting the traditional Venturi Scott Brown, paradigm by simultaneously illustrating the concepts of both decorative shed and the duck. I don't know what that means, but it
Those are
is.
both buildings that they did.
Oh, you're wow. It's been a long day. I completely forgot.
It's been a long year, Cormac.
But and I was just thinking, I was like, that every, like each of these buildings, like each of the buildings that of all the different people, and even some of the people that he talked about that are kind of like modern, people who don't take things as seriously as kind of like the established, like four walls and a roof kind of architect kind of thing. That it just I started to appreciate like playful natures
Mm-hmm.
of
Mm-hmm.
things
Mm-hmm.
that like we don't necessarily do enough of.
So serious.
Yeah. you know
Yes.
and,
I
yeah.
agree. I agree. I felt like that this was a huge talk, and it was a great reminder. I think this totally exemplifies what MDC is so good at, which is reminding you why you became an architect in the
Right.
first place.
And if you think about like why, when you were becoming an architect as a baby in school, what were all of your projects? Your projects were not like defined by the constraints.
Right.
They were playful. They were fun.
Break the rules. Break all the rules, right?
9 times out of 10, people would say that can never be built. And then you have architects like
And you
Frank
never got
Gehry.
graded down for that.
exactly. But I mean, then you have like people like Frank Gehry who they're like, that's, like, oh, that's preposterous. That's never going to be built. And he's like,
Watch me.
exactly.
Hold my beer.
Hold my beer. Watch me.
Right.
And he does it. And people are like, what the hell? Now, there's people who are just like, oh my gosh, this is just a self-serving thing. And it's like, in a way it might be, but I went from, kind of having like a love affair with, Frank in school to then kind of like being,
You go through your phases. Sure.
well, but I mean, it just kind of like, it's just like, okay, well, the constraints are kind of like weighing. It's like, how does he get away with all of this? This is preposterous, and then you just like, you're so focused on just like, well, that can't be built, or these are like the rules and stuff like that. And then you don't really like stop to think about it. It's just like, dude, think about how fun that must have been to like convince people to do this. And like, James Wines, like convincing the best company to like do these buildings and become adventurous and be playful. I mean, don't take yourself serious. I mean, you are a serious company, but you don't have to like, take yourself so seriously.
I just feel like it's like even more than that, right? It's just kind of elevating the conversation. And
yeah.
it's like it is a serious sport that we play in here. It is. But that we can bring those conversations to these other levels. We have the ability to do that. Does it always work? Of course not. Do we always find the clients to be able? Of course not. But if that magic exists there, man, like it seriously can elevate the plane of the conversation to these other levels. And to me, like that's what you feed off as an architect.
Yeah.
Cool stuff.
Yeah.
So once again, MDC was incredible. I don't know that it was as incredible as ones that I've remembered. Maybe I'm remembering them better than they actually were, but I do feel like it did its job. And that job is to bring you back every 2 years. This time it was 3 years, but every 2 years, and reignite, refuel, get pumped about why we got into this in the first place, and bring that back into what we do on a day-to-day basis. And that to me is like super successful in that. And I always appreciate people who figure this MDC thing out, because that can't be an easy job. And at the same time, it's just, I think it really does exactly what it needs to do for the audience that shows up.
I'll tell you, the one that sticks with me that will never go away is Rand Elliott.
Mm-hmm.
I always think about that often, actually. And I think, just the two that we had talked about, he would have fit perfectly with that conversation, because there is the playful yet sustainably minded kind of aspect to all of his work that, I don't know.
Well, I think that about the stuff that we've talked about with Rural Studio.
Yeah.
Right? Like the solutions that can come out of creative constraints, whether they're material, whether it's existing structure, adaptive reuse.
Yeah.
Just, man, it's like that kind of stuff is incredible. And it's really, I appreciate it so much. So yeah, it is funny how you can start to tie these things back to like what the other pieces of the puzzle are that fit this narrative. And I'm glad we have those to be able to kind of draw from over time, because they really do help kind of sustain us as we move through this really tough profession. Thanks for listening. This show is part of the Gable Media Podcast Network. See all the shows at gablemedia.com. That's GABLMEDIA.com. You can help support what we're doing here by leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts to help get the word out, and don't forget to share it with your friends. We'd love to hear from you, so leave a comment on the website at archispeakpodcast.com, where you can find our entire catalog of shows. Talk to you soon.